This is the debrief of my first solo flight after obtaining the PPL. The mission was to move an aircraft, a Cessna 172, from the airfield of Zabrze, here in the upper right hand corner, to Medlanki, at the bottom left hand side corner. This is the picture of the original plan that I had made. I'd prepared it like the day before, the evening before I prepared. I took the forecast of the winds and everything, and I'd lined up this route. It was a known route. It's a very nice route. It goes over some hills, which means I need to go up into some altitude, and then turning south it goes down a very nice valley, a very long valley and a nice valley to get into Medlanki. In this way I would be avoiding to go through CTRs and avoiding traffic of maybe other airfields around. So that was the initial plan. I prepared also the flight log, of course. I prepared the altitude, the winds aloft and everything. I'd had the frequencies and I'd had this printed out so that I would have it there on my kneeboard to be able to be ready. And my aim was also to do manual navigation, let's say, with paper map, to have that in the cabin with me and to try to use the references and find my way through. I would always have the GPS as a backup, but my aim was actually to practice with paper. Unfortunately, on the way to the airfield, checking the weather, we noticed that it was not going to be so easy. This is not an actual picture from Windy, because I don't have that picture anymore, but we did see some similar clouds gathering from the north and from the west that was actually closing in a little bit. So all the planning, all the work that I'd put in the day before, which was a couple of hours, basically went out the window. So the first lessons learned is that one should prepare, one has to plan, but one also has to be ready and flexible to change then the plan. Eventually then I took another path, which is going to say the easterly path, so turning first towards the south and then going towards the west. It was also a nice route. I've done it before on the training 2 or 3 times at least, so it's not an unknown route, and it's also a nice route, but much more congested in terms of airfields and things that one has to watch out for. And of course I could not do any more the manual navigation other than with what I knew, because I did not have the plan. So I had to rely entirely on the GPS, which worked of course very well, but it was a pity that I didn't get that training. The first thing I decided was to try to avoid the Ostrava control tower, so I steered clear of it, and I went to this little town, LKHN, which is Hranice, a nice little town. I went around it also. I made one circuit around it just to look at it and to admire it from the top. And it has a very nice airfield, which I've never landed at yet. So that's one of the aims, one of the excursions is going to be to go there and practice landing there, and eventually to go and visit the little village, which it's not a village, it's a town with some very interesting sights, I believe. Then we can't see it very well on this picture, but what I basically did, I was weaving my way through between the different ATZs from the airfields, so that I wouldn't bother anybody. I wouldn't have to do then the radio, and typically the radio has to be in the local language, so it's much more difficult also, and I know that sometimes it can be busy, so I just avoided that. What I could not avoid then was eventually to cross the CTR of the Brno airport, so I did request permission for transit, which was good, like a good practice. They gave it right away without any problem, and even inside that CTR there was a bit of traffic separation need, with also a lessons learned that I got from there. And then eventually I got into Medlanki, all well and safe. So this was actually then the eventual route that I took. And now let's go and look at some of the images that I managed to film from the flight, from the takeoff and the route and then the final landing. It was quite early in the morning actually, as you see there, that's sunrise, what we can see there. But there was already some traffic, at least 1 or 2 light craft, like ultralights were flying, because the wind was very calm, so it was of course very good. And this of course here I'm lining up and taking off, first time solo, so after the PPL of course, so it was a bit like the first solo, the feeling of after so many months, I think weeks, I'm not sure how long, that I managed actually to fly again, and I think it went well. Easy, right rudder, and then up in the air relatively fast of course, as it was quite light, the airplane. One thing that I intend to do, and I did in this case, is whenever possible to try to do, whenever I leave an airfield, try to do a touch and go on it to practice that landing and that approach, right? So the first thing I did was come back for the touch and go. I'd already informed the instructor it was on the ground and going home, so just in case he was afraid. So I did the landing. I think it went okay, relatively smooth. I was happy with it. I pulled up the nose enough, and then I touched down, and then with touchdown, then carb heat off, flaps back up to 10 as we are on grass, and then up again into the air. There in the background, what we can see is already this kind of cloud formation that was coming. That was kind of the original direction that I was going to be going, but as I said before, I chose the safe route and not going to the clouds. After departing the traffic pattern for the airfield, then I took a mostly southerly base. Here I started to record just because I see that there's some blue roads. I think those indicate that there are bridges, maybe to tell the drivers that you're over a bridge. I'd never seen it before, so just out of curiosity I decided to start the recording. Here, as I say, I'm turning towards the south. I do have the 80s from Ostrava to make sure that I have the right QNH. And basically, to avoid that CTR, I do go over a little bit of hills, so I do go a bit lower than, maybe closer to the ground than I would have chosen to. But on the other hand, it was also a good experience and nice to see. And all the time when I was close to that CTR, I did have the radio tuned in and I was listening to see what kind of traffic, or if they would try to call me or something. I do go through very slight clouds. I mean, it's not really clouds, but I was at some point worried, like, is this going to become really cloudy? Because on VFR, of course, you're not allowed to go through clouds. But of course, I did have the ground in sight at all moments, so no risk from that perspective. And here I'm arriving over the small town of Hranice. It's a nice little town. I've never been there actually, but it's a place that I would really like to go to at some point. I did communicate with the airfield. There is an airfield. There was no traffic. I couldn't hear anything, but in any case I did communicate. I said who I was, where I was coming from, altitude, and what was I going to do, just to make sure. Like, I'm not sure if that's normal or not, even before I entered the airfield area. But I just said I'm going to go around the town just in case there was somebody preparing to take off, and something that they would be aware that there is somebody up there in the air. So I think that's what's called transmitting blind. I did it, and then I went around the town as I showed you here, and then I went further south to avoid another airfield. I'll leave some images here of Hranice from the air. A bit further on top of that hill, there's the castle of Helfstein. It's one of the largest castles in the country by area, and I believe it dates back to the 13th century. And what I understand, it was built by a kind of a pirate, like a marauding knight that would actually raid merchants. This area is called the Moravian Gate, which actually is a valley through which all the transport, all the connections had to go if they wanted to go from the southern part of Europe up to the north part of Europe. So connecting Italy, Austria area up to Poland and the Baltic Sea. So another piece of history there, a fantastic history that we have here that is well worth remembering, of course. In these images, I'm already in the Brno CTR. I of course did request permission to enter, and it was granted readily, no big problem with that. But there was a bit of traffic. There was another Cessna, I believe it was, coming in the opposite direction. And a lesson learned for me is that I did understand that the air traffic controller was telling to the other Cessna to look out for me at 11 o'clock. And I don't know why, but I just thought, well, if I'm at his 11 o'clock, he must be at my 1 o'clock, right? Wrong. I then saw him at 11 o'clock, so that somehow I went home and then drew the pictures of the little clocks to see. So if I'm at 11 o'clock for somebody, I'm also at their 11 o'clock, right? And vice versa. So it goes, I think, with most times. So that was a lesson learned. I was looking for that playing in the wrong place. There was no risk, of course. They kept us well separate. I think we had like 300 or 400 feet separation also in altitude. So no real problem there. At some point I requested approval for frequency change to go over to the Medlanki radio, and I did actually manage to find that recording on the live ATC net. If you don't know it, that's where you can, in many airports, you can listen to the air traffic control, and they do have recordings there. So I did manage to get a bit of that communication from there, not completely, but some of it. And I moved over to the Medlanki radio. I had landed at this airport, but I think only twice, so not too many times. Once solo and once with the instructor. And it's a bit of a challenging airport because there's some noise abatement, there's a zoo nearby, there's some houses also that they also request us to not fly over. So a little bit nervous about it. It's almost a one-way landing strip because it's on an uphill or downhill, so basically people try to take off downhill and land uphill. So I was a little bit nervous about it, but I think I managed it okay. I followed the procedure. I went to full flaps, I believe already at base, maybe even on the downwind, because then the base and the final would be very short. So I managed it okay. Then I pulled up, and being an uphill strip, it is true that the runway kind of jumps up at one. So an interesting one, a very nice airfield actually. I like to go there also. That's why I actually go to fly the models if I can, if they don't close it down. But a nice place to go to. And with that actually concludes then this trip. I managed to do the trip successfully. I managed to land the airplane without crashing it, and a successful landing and parking it, and looking forward to many more such flights and different flights in the area. Really very nice countryside.